programming phases and planning, but very practical, like places to start that we've identified. The first one is communities are meaningful stakeholders in two-way, transparent, and open flows of information. So this is possible to achieve, and there are several specific practical examples I'm going to show now as far as how we're moving towards that goal of having those flows functional. Communities know and claim their rights, so they have meaningful ownership and leadership roles. This is achieved primarily through training. So this means having accessible pedagogical methods which allow communities to become aware of what the humanitarian response process is, how it works, what are the clusters, for example. And so you have different types of exercises to achieve that. And communities have mechanisms to register concerns and provide continuous feedback. You could argue that this is one of the areas that is most worked on already by many organizations, not just iMMAP. So there are tools that allow for registering concerns and providing feedback. To give some examples, Loop or Kuja Kuja, they both have very interesting processes. So this is UNICEF's kind of community engagement figure, which includes all the different aspects that overlap as far as the processes. This is a process that we are participating under UNICEF LTA. We're participating in building, and there you can see one of the more popular ones that goes before community engagement and what's understood as community engagement is accountability to affected populations. So what did we do in the case of Colombia? First, we looked a bit at what the dynamic of where people were living in Colombia as far as where communities were being formed. So last year I went into a lot of detail on how, on the technical side, we use satellite imagery to detect where there were expansions of settlements throughout the country. So we've been able to detect about 1,000 settlements thus far, 150,000 people more or less, and so that we've created an inventory. But when we really wanted to reach the communities and have an impact in information management inside those settlements that we had detected, we had to come through and provide new tools and engage the community with bidirectional communication tools. So we created a process which is focused on creating an information flow. So the first process is, and this is very important. So on the one hand, I would argue that if any organization that's focused on information management and not on response is going to be adapted to providing sort of like an unbiased, impartial perspective when they're trying to collect information about what response should be carried out. So if you have say, and this is very typical, like every organization that has gone in the past to these different settlements applies a battery of questions, right? And they will ask according to the types of services they offer, a series of questions to design their programming. But the expansion, the portfolio of programming that is typically available for any one organization is going to be limited. So the kind of questions they ask are going to be limited. So one of the questions as far as principles is, I think that it makes sense, and this is the same argument that is used for why OCHA, for example, should not execute programming, that they should be like arbiters and information managers, but they should not actually be collecting funding to execute programming, because it could potentially result in bias, right, at the end of the day, towards what type of prioritization is made. And so this whole process, we do it in any case with other organizations. In all cases, we are We are engaging because since we don't also offer services, that also creates a risk. If you are to ask people what they need and then you have no ability to give them anything, then you're just creating a problem, right? So at the end of the day, you have to go in, preferably with a number of organizations backing you up. In this case, in Colombia, we went in with the NGO Forum. The NGO Forum was interested in, first of all, understanding places where they had missed. So throughout the country, there were many settlements where no one had provided any assistance. And across the board, these settlements, which were very new, you know, like the last 2-3 years, they were created by Venezuelan migrants primarily. They found they needed to have interventions. And so we went in directly with the organizations. In moment zero, you see there, we discuss what we would offer. And then if there's interest and there's commitment on the side, both of the community and the organization that are partnering, then we move forward to the next stage. So we call it moment zero because we don't consider that we actually we've started the process until it's finished and there's a yes. So then when we go into moment one, then what we do is we have an identification of local capacities in the community. So we want to understand how the community solves its own problems. And we go in, we use, there's a humanitarian OpenStreetMap tool called Osman. We teach the community how to use it to map their own resources. And we use that sort of like as a base map for where, so like a pharmacy, a store, many little sort of services that they already have in the community, a daycare center, someplace where children are cared for. And that input, you know, they're going to basically just be with their cell phones or with someone's cell phone in the community, and they will finish that process. But they won't see anything yet. They won't see the final product. Then when you get to moment two, you will have, what we do then is we take a drone and we fly over the community. We get permissions, of course. There are always a series of permissions that you have to have, both from the community again and from the authorities. And then what we do is we collect information. We make an orthophoto map and we 3D print the community, we make a scale map of the location. Then we take that, we have a social cartography workshop, and we start to identify humanitarian needs. And during that process, we're listening to the community, we're mapping the information they have, but we're going to come back to it over and over. And that we enhance with moment 4, which is the training needs diagnosis workshop, where we speak with them, we find what their understanding of for example, humanitarian needs are and how they define them. And we try to homogenize it, put it together with what the cluster system is, or the different, or the sectors. And then we create a series of exercises over what's up. So I'll share more of that here in just a minute. And then we monitor and we create a series of processes where they create their own maps and send that with a photograph. And so we have updated versions of the information that they provide. So these are locations throughout Colombia we started with. There are only 6 locations here. This year we'll expand to 20 locations. And each of these communities have between 200 and 1,000 people, more or less, to give you an idea of the size of the communities we're working in. And each of these communities, they have, these are the community leaders. We give them all a t-shirt. They participate in their communities. They've already been usually associated with other programming in the community. And these are the actual 3D scale models that we create there. And you see they have the QR code at the margin, and that allows it. So when they take a photo of the exercises they do, then it's automatically georeferenced onto what's called a sketch map. So these, like, to give you an idea as far as the costs of this, it's not very expensive. It's $1,500 for the drone overflight and the printing out of the scale model. So, you know, it's very high precision as far as, and we're trying to actually, with a company called Black Shark, they have scale models of the entire world, but it's very proprietary. It's Black Shark is part of Maxar, and theoretically we could get access to a lot of locations with 15-centimeter models and be able to print them out without drone overflights, which can be good in some cases. This gives a bit of an idea of how we're working. So we use a lot of pedagogical sort of methodologies where we are looking, first of all, to foment digital literacy. We want people to understand the very basic concepts of how they use their cell phone, how to use WhatsApp. Everything is over WhatsApp. In the case of Colombia, that's very popular. In other countries, like in Ukraine, Telegram is more popular. But the focus here is to have that communication and be able to respond when they ask for certain types of training, to be able to offer it remotely. And we work with a civil society organization that helps develop the content on this, and also use a chatbot to be able to interact with them. So these are the different modules that we have on that. And so now the focus here is to be able to connect. We're connecting all these different communities here with nodes to have communication, training, and monitoring over time. Eventually, if we're able to integrate this as part of a strategy, like more on the HRP level, and now I'll go to the HRP, sort of how the HRPs are set up and how much they're incorporating these types of tools thus far. The idea is that this kind of network could be able to send information periodically, and it could go way beyond annual. The idea, if you're going to, is you'll see now with looking at how the HRPs incorporate communities with community engagement, it's very sporadic. So it's like usually once a year you have surveys carried out. And so whereas if you're in what's recognized as a chronic humanitarian emergency, you're going to be having situations all year. You're not going to have just a once a year thing. So if for a community to feel engaged, it requires more than once a year interactions. So the network. We also, one of the goals we have, and this still requires work, is to have a commitment. And this requires a commitment from the partners that we're going into communities with. And that is to actually have adjustments to programming made on the basis of the information received from the community. So what you see typically, an organization, I'll give you some examples, like Mercy Corps or Bluemont will have their own processes, right, which are completely legitimate to be able to work on initially establishing what their programming is going to be during the entire life cycle of the project. The challenge is, how can you create more responsible and flexible programming that adjusts based on the feedback you get from the community? And if you look at what the organizations we partnered with, without naming, like because it gives sort of like a name and shame kind of dynamic, but like if you look at the partners we've worked with, what you see is that they fix in programming initially in the project. They will collect data, but the data will not be shared with the community. The results of the surveys will not be shared. In fact, it's very hard to access. What we had to do was sort of explain the use of this, the reason why the community should have access to the data that was collected by their own programmers, and programmers like their project workers, and then put it onto the maps. So this is not a typical process. They would never do this normally. But after they saw it on the map, lots of times they don't have the capability either of mapping it out, right, in a useful way for the community in a large map. Sometimes when they do their own project proposal, which can be at the initial stage, they won't put it on a map either for the donor or in the concept note. So we extract all that, we put it onto maps, and we put it into the process. But the challenge you see is that there's a lot of dynamics as far as what type of information is collected. It's not very standardized, and it's very tailored to the type of offerings, as I was saying at the beginning, that the organization may choose to or has in their portfolio as an ability to offer. In order to make this into AAP, you have to integrate it in a systematic manner, and you have to integrate it with the program partners. So these organizations, there's willingness in several of the partners to do it. But if you were to have a push from a donor to be working on this, and whichever schematic you chose, then it would happen. But not until you have sort of a framework that's adopted across the board, so that all the partner organizations are interested. This is a bit more information on the training needs diagnostic workshop, and a bit you get an idea there exactly how we're working with the communities with the training, and we're trying to do. This is one of the things with all the new AI that is coming out. There's a lot. We haven't done it with this, but we have another chatbot set up. We're doing with UNICEF, LACRO, and text to voice and voice to text is also something that's very powerful. So our plan is for this year, we start to, we already have video compilations, but it's very standardized. But to be able to transform text to voice so that all of our responses come back as voice messages, so we can send voice messages to the communities. And there we have a bit more on the monitoring. So I want to go to this point right here, which has to do with a series of community engagements we've done, or community engagement products we've done with social and behavioral change program. And I was leading this group for the last year, which is called the Technical Working Group 3 on Community Engagement Data Systems, Tools, and Guides. And we had these 4 products that we were engaged with UNICEF to produce. One was Community Engagement Common Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, Compendium of Case Studies on Community Engagement. This is with the HRPs. Interactive Database of Community Engagement Indicators and Humanitarian Response Plans and Other Documents, and Desk Review of Community Engagement Indicators and Humanitarian Response Plans and Other Documents. So you can see these are some of the specific areas that we were working on. One is we were trying to ensure humanitarian action is people-centered, is community-led, and is reaching the most disadvantaged sectors. So what's necessary to look at that? You have to define what are the indicators that need to be measured in order to determine if these 3 things are happening. And here are the standards. There's the 6 standards, which you can find in the UNICEF guidelines on community engagement. These are the indicators that, and there are a series of both outcome and output indicators and input indicators that you can see. There's a full graphic in the documents, but the overarching ones, you can see there, the outcome ones are the most important. And it has to do with participation, measuring the empowerment and ownership of processes, measuring inclusion, measuring two-way communication, which I said was one of the easier wins, you can say, measuring adaptability and localization, and measuring building on local capacity. So all these dimensions of community engagement need to be measured in order for us to be able to say if an HRP has successfully or not incorporated community engagement in their planning processes. So if you go through, it's quite complex, the number of indicators, and we have to look. We went through all the HRPs, and we went one by one looking at each cluster, what indicators were actually being measured and which ones were not. And you can see these are the HRP countries. You can see very few countries have any community engagement indicators. Yes? Okay. So the winner of the most community engagement indicators was Iraq. There was no comparison. And then, but you have to go dive into the types of indicators that were used by which clusters, and then you start finding some more interesting results there. And here you can see, so Iraq won mainly because of the protection cluster, which had 44 indicators. One observation here was that out of more than 100 indicators, not one was repeated, even between countries. So the fact that they created, of course, principles and standards, minimum standards, they didn't have any homogenization at all, which may be all right. You know, that they didn't want to create standard indicators that had to go across countries, but it does create complexities when you want to compare, you know, between two of the countries. And there's a lot of diversity there, but overall, there's another thing you have to see as far as outcome versus output. And really, the only ones that were even focused on the outcomes was AAP. You know, AAP groups were focused on community engagement outcomes, whereas the other ones would be focused on much more targeted sort of results and products for the short term. And that's a bit of what are the community engagement indicators by subgroup. Those are not clusters, subgroups. So here's this is the desk review document, which I encourage you to look at too. Where again, here we're saying some indicators are similar but not common. None of the logistical frameworks are structured the same way. So we're hoping that having sort of this monitoring and evaluation framework as an option could become something that's implemented. It gives more structure, to give like a menu, you know, of potential indicators that could be chosen. Yeah, and the protection cluster by far is the one that had the most. You can also see it on a dashboard format, what the results were. And most recently, this was just a few weeks ago. For me, the community engagement dynamic is fascinating. I think there's just a huge amount of potential to transform the entire humanitarian sector here. And what's exciting about it is, first of all, focusing on community leaders, training them, and giving them tools. So seeing how they can make use of it, not just the humanitarian organizations. So it changes the dynamic quite a bit if you can do this. And what's really going to change the ballgame too is the types of tools that are going to be available to communities in the future and be accessible. Those are some of the participants we had. We had examples from really all over the world. Some of the participants are in the talk. And what we hope to accomplish in Colombia, as I said, we have thus far, we're we have some two-way communication tools. We have processes so that the community can participate, but we don't have results as far as changes in programming, flexible programming, responding to changing demands from the communities. So the hope is, I don't know how many are familiar with this, but at the global level, which has launched the flagship initiative, there are 4 countries that are included in this 3-year initiative. One of them is in Colombia. And yeah, the 3, Niger, South Sudan, and the Philippines. The focus is to be able to have more flexible coordination systems, planning mechanisms, and potential to incorporate communities specifically. So this is the group of the flagship initiative, reflection group for Colombia, and then they have we have a series of working groups for planning. It's very typical UN result. But the focus will be, I think, and what we hope to accomplish is to have these different tools incorporated into the planning process for the flagship initiative. So it's an opportunity to go beyond a typical HRP and be able to have also a more frequent reporting process, not just have a 1-year document, but have a period of, so every month right now from the communities where we are working, we're receiving information from them. And the question is, how can the humanitarian response be more flexible and be able to respond to the information as it comes in? So we're going to put this to the test, see if the flagship initiative in Colombia is the right environment for it to actually achieve this, but that's the goal. So that's my presentation. I don't know if you have any questions regarding all these points that aren't too specific on data. I can look it up, but like on the reports. Yes. You can use that.
Good. Sorry. My name is Mariela Kiprianou. I'm the Global Food Security Cluster Co-Coordinator. I work jointly with FAO on the co-coordination of the cluster. Question just for me to understand on your last slide. How do, and maybe you've mentioned it, but for me it was not clear, also because the whole flagship is a bit of a fuzzy area, especially when it comes to the clusters, right? But I don't want to deal with that. And it's more what it means for you, if you could do a bit more of a deep dive or a bit more of an explanation of what the flagship will mean in terms of AAP and in general. I know the document says it's closer to the affected populations, but what does it really mean in actual terms? That if you have any information, that will be useful. Thank you.
Well, you can see that it's right now very process oriented. So at this point in the game, the information as far as what's defined in the flagship initiative, it's what you're saying, that it's kind of fuzzy. But there's definitely, it's leaning towards having more community participation. So we take that as an opportunity to try to propose the inclusion of communities in a systematic manner. So if we have tools that can be put into the process, then we do that. And so we're going to try to propose that. And but who defines that at the end of the day will be the flagship initiative coordination group, will be OCHA, the RC, as well as in the case of Colombia, there are 2 coordination structures. So there's also the GIFM as well. So, and I think that's one of the reasons that they want to have Colombia as one of the pilots, is because there are 2 systems. So they want to have, so it may be necessary as well to be able to create processes that inform both of the standardized planning processes. So I can definitely see how it could work, but it will require a lot of movement, a lot of, if it gets bogged down in the processes, like with the different working groups, then it can all die easily. Yeah, but it's an opportunity. You have to try. Any other questions? Everyone, does anyone else in this room, has anyone worked on a community engagement process? Do you see any value added to having this type of framework for monitoring and evaluation? You think that this is something you'll use? This is a proposal, right? The UNICEF is, of course, using it. iMMAP was paid to create the tool, but I'm interested in like hearing as well if you have any feedback on the ideas there.
I'm from Pakistan, and we have a community engagement, and basically we train them in. So basically, we have a system of an emergency services and emergency response, but then since it's a big population of about 120 million that we're looking at, so without the community engagement, it wasn't possible. So the moment you get out of the city, especially major cities, so we've got the communities and we've trained communities for response, but now making them, engaging them more for prevention and risk identification and others within their communities. Obviously, this monitoring tools and will be very helpful in terms of monitoring their engagement and how they're performing over there. So you've got about 125,000 volunteers now trained and down to the village level. And so that's where we were really looking at that we can have a monitoring tool which shows their engagement and makes it more effective.
And have you measured the depth of the community engagement you've had thus far? Have you created indicators and been able to?
No, I think we were missing with the monitoring tools. I think that's something which is really required now.
Yeah.
It's not just the numbers, it's actually now you need to look at, and effectively, just training them for response was fine, but now we need to look at their engagement, and we would need the monitoring tools in order to evaluate the engagement process. Yeah.
Very good.
So this will be very helpful, what you've actually presented. Thanks.
Very good. Any other reactions? Otherwise, thank you very much. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Glenn. I'm from Global Support and Development. I was just wondering if the initial mapping process takes into account local NGOs and the efforts that they undertake for the community.
Yeah. So as far as the initial process that I showed at the very beginning, I'll go back. That thing is, it's like so long. The initial process, we work with all the organizations in the community that are currently have a process. So the focus, if you're doing any type of mapping, the value added is to be able to have map everyone's activities, as well as mapping the yeah. So when we engage initially, we start with the members of the NGO forum. And so the NGO forum has 31 organizations. It has only 4 national NGOs. But at the community level, there are also a lot of CSOs. And there's also the use, in this case, of migrant organizations to sort of, there are a series of Venezuelan migrant organizations that operate in Colombia and have some funding from PRM through Blumont in this case. And so they provide some sustainability. So what you do is you give some funding to them to participate in the process, and then they continue to engage after you leave. This is the idea. So that gives some infrastructure, which fortunately, in this case, PRM has been funding these CSOs under Blumont. But there's a lot of, the geographic coverage, you see at the beginning, this is very incipient. We think it's a model. There are others that will also work, but it's a participatory process, GIS. That's what it is. Using some of the tools that are now available and using WhatsApp chatbot to maintain communications. So I think the question is, how do you and using for social cartography, using what SketchMap, which allows you to take any kind of drawings that you make and put them into a GIS. So it's a way of making sort of a system much more adaptable and be able to integrate more different types of inputs from the community. Yeah. So there has been, I mean, right now, the one of the challenges is, I would say, incorporating things like this into the HRP or MRP, because there's no strategy as far as how that would happen. And if that were to become a strategic item, then there would be a lot more participation. It would become more widespread, I think. So there's, and the national NGOs aren't as much participating in HRPs or MRPs either, comparatively. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I'm a visiting scholar in Geneva Graduate Institute. So my question is, maybe not, I'm outsider of this issue area, but I'm just thinking about when we're talking about the community engagement. So what kind of role is this kind of local people? So they are cooperate with the strategy, or they are part of decision maker, or so what kind of the role of the local people inside?
Yes. So, I was saying the first stages, these are the first things that we've been able to do directly with them. So they become stakeholders in a transparent, open flows of information. Communities know and claim their rights. They have meaningful ownership and leadership roles, and they have mechanisms to register concerns and provide continuous feedback on the response that's been given thus far. So those are the three areas. But that's, of course, incomplete, because a complete role, set of roles for community engagement would include planning, that the community leaders are directly engaged in the planning process from the start, in prioritization, to make sure that the type of assistance given is the assistance that they prioritize. So in practice, what is the reality? An organization comes to a community and they have so many things they can give. And so they will ask a survey, and they will prioritize between the things that they have in their portfolio, right? And then, they get what they get, and then sometimes they're asked, what if they're satisfied with the service. That's usual. It doesn't always happen, but it very frequently happens. But there's, of course, several components missing. If you're going to do it with a completely meaningful leadership role, they should be consulted at the very beginning. They should be able to determine the type of assistance that arrives. And so that requires more coordination, of course, because in order for that to happen, you can't just have different organizations arrive in different locations randomly, and then, because of course they can only offer certain things that they're specialized in. But if the process starts with a consultation with the community leaders, where they decide, okay, I want food and wash items and assistance, instead of having someone that comes with protection, or the vice versa, it can be, then the coordination body ensures that the right organization arrives in that community. You see what I'm saying? But this requires a lot of improved coordination, granularity, and the type of information being obtained, because everything happens at the community level. Lots of times the planning process is happening in a capital, or one thing I saw happen early in the response in this case on Venezuela, was there were a lot of assumptions made, and so donors wanted to act very quickly. They designated certain locations as being priority for intervention, and they made it based on a few visits. But the reality is, at the community level, that every community is different, and it's very complex. So this requires that you find low-cost alternatives for and frequent feedback where you can get information with the granularity you need on time so that you're able to help coordinate so the right organization goes to the right place. So it's a complex problem to resolve, I think. I think it's not an easy, it has to be understood. Community engagement, and this is one thing that I don't, like all the principles and concepts, I think they're very well thought out. But what's difficult is the logistical aspect. So when you get into things like the flagship initiative, everyone likes the way community engagement sounds. It's there. Immediately they put it in, right? But what is the what are the real implications to try to be able to give a meaningful leadership role and make them have an influence on what the assistance that arrives to them is? This requires a lot of information, I would argue. And I see it, of course, as iMMAP, I think of everything almost as information. But I do think this is an information problem. And I think technology is going to allow us in the future to be able to resolve the problem. Whereas before it was maybe impossible. But now I think it's more achievable. So this is just one approach. I think there's more that can be done. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Howard. I work for CAFOD, which is the UK part of the Caritas Confederation. And we have a number of partners in Colombia, including SMPS, Caritas Colombia, and their networks of local groups, Afro-Caribbean, Indigenous, women's organizations, and others. One initiative that they led alongside other actors in the UN and Red Cross a couple of years back was a grand bargain country-level dialogue on localization. And their main interest in that was to see that effort not just be the mainstream larger UN agencies and bigger national NGOs or INGOs, but to reach out to local level and community networks and coordination, even if it may not be called that, kind of processes happening at a decentralized level that were completely off the radar for the mainstream kind of UN NGO humanitarian coordination. And that was an interesting process. And I should say, apologies, I missed almost all of your presentation. It looks super interesting, and I hope that it's possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint or a recording. But I was just wondering, from what I understood, there's this sort of tech effort to bring those, to lift up those community perspectives and have that fed into decision-making linked to this OCHA flagship initiative, which sounds very interesting. So I was just wondering if you could comment, and apologies if you already did this in the presentation, on how that kind of tech initiative and OCHA process might link to then a process of dialogue with donors and agencies at different levels to surface issues around partnerships, funding, support to community structures and organizations rooted in communities that may not currently benefit from funding through the UN system and may not be able to because of the kinds of due diligence and other administrative and bureaucratic barriers that exist. I guess it builds on the comment from the previous colleague about connecting with local NGOs, because there are so many local and national organizations that are rooted in and working with these communities that don't access funding, cannot or do not engage with the coordination processes. And it's great if there's a sort of tech solution or a systematic effort to do that. But that is sounded from what I caught, it was more about the humanitarian needs or issues or dynamics, whereas then there also is value in having a dialogue about the modalities of partnership and funding and voice on supporting organizations that are rooted in those communities. So, and if that question's completely off ball because I missed or already addressed, then big apologies from my side. Thank you.
No, it's not off board, but it's like that's even harder than what we're doing. So it's like I can't pretend that like we've gotten to the point where the grand bargain is made a reality. Like with the CSOs, that would be very difficult. No, what I presented there was just focused on focused on, yeah, a tech solution and focused on specifically under the community engagement standards, these points here, without having achieved yet planning from the start with all the participating partners, and focused on NGO forum members. So with the aspiration of informing the flagship initiative process. But the funding question is a good one. At the end of the day, we're starting with a combination of empowering local community leaders and supporting organizations that are already in these prioritized communities. So there include both national and international NGOs, but it doesn't have any direct funding impact necessarily. That's, of course, would be the best possible outcome in the end of at the end of the day, is to be able to actually help mobilize funding for the interventions as well. But yeah, I will definitely share the PowerPoint so that you have access to that. And I don't know if it's being recorded as well, Pierre. I don't know. Yeah. So there's also a recording. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up comment as well. Just, it wasn't also, I think that was hopefully obvious from the question. It wasn't implying that your initiative needs to take on everything, or it's more about the connection between what you're doing and then the need for other efforts and processes to address. And if this initiative can help unlock some of that more systematic, evidenced perspectives from community level, and as you say, then lead to catalyzing conversations about funding and what are the best modalities and partnerships that can effectively resource their organizing and their agency and their leadership in addressing the issues that come through your process. So anyway, thank you.
One day it'll happen. Any other questions? If not, then thank you very much.